So my name is Stephanie Gotard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Huntington Historical Society. Professor Darling was asking me how long we've been around. We've been around since 1903. And if you're not familiar with our organization, you could check out our website, huntingtonhistoricalsociety.org. And we have properties, we have plenty of events and all things going on. We have a monthly lunch and learn, as well as other monthly programs at other price points. We're very happy that for everyone who's a member here on the lunch and learn today, for supporting us. And if you'd like to become a member, if you find that what you hear today is to your liking, maybe you'll join us and come for other programs. I would like to introduce Marsha Tyson Darling. She's a professor, emerita professor, who has recently served as a special assistant to the president of strategic initiatives in executive leadership, professor of history and interdisciplinary studies, and a director of truth, racial healing, and transformation campus center at Adelphi University. And how we came to know Professor Darling is because one of our employees, Dory Jo, had gone to Adelphi undergraduate, and she said, "Oh, I have someone for you. You gotta get her." So I was so delighted that Dory Jo recommended her. Professor Darling has also taught at Georgetown University, the University of Maryland at College Park, Wesleyan College, and Hood College. She's held a postdoc research appointments at E.W. Du Bois Institute of African American Research at Harvard University, the Oral History Research Office at Columbia University. Oh my gosh, you have like you're hitting you gotta go to Brown next, I guess, Professor. And come on, you gotta hit all the Ivies. Share the love, for everybody. She's done so many things, and I'll put up her bio in when I send out my thank you email, so you can revel in her fantastic, quite impressive resume. And if you published anything, let us know so we can read some of your other things. That would be fantastic. But we're here today celebrating Black history. And when I proposed a topic to Professor Dolan, she goes, "No, I don't want to do that. This is what I want to talk about." So I said, "You know what? You're the professor. We'll talk about whatever you want to, as we're celebrating Black history, and the Historical Society is also really trying to do Black history, not just during February and for Juneteenth, but throughout the year, celebrating it." So I'm happy that a professor could be with us today and enlighten us on the topic that she has selected to talk about: reimagining ourselves, changing tomorrow, what's involved. And I know we're going to be have a great discussion and program today, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And let me take a moment to thank Stephanie for this invitation to have a conversation with you about, yes, Black history, but also what's happening now and how social transformations over the past 150, 180 years have a cyclical dimension to them. And we are in one of those cycles now. And so I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. I have some insights and some comments to share. I have a PowerPoint to share. And then plenty of time for Q&A. So can I see thumbs if everyone can see the PowerPoint? Perfect. Okay, very good. So reimagining ourselves, what's involved? So let's begin. So the focus of my comments for today, actually, let me just minimize this right here. Great. So the focus of my comments for today so we will explore the cyclical manner in which sweeping social transformations of two natures: one, advancing and opposing human and civil rights for Black people, that the cyclical manner has produced 3 reconstructions in our nation's history, and we are in the midst of one of them right now, which is what makes our conversations about this issue timely and really very important. Secondly, I would like us to think about examining these threshold social transformations, human rights, civil rights progress, and opposition to that progress known as backlashes, and how that provides us with insights into contemporary issues and events. And that those insights can point us towards timely, pressing solutions as we consider the current challenges to constitutional democracy and the protection of human and civil rights. And so what I am setting out to do today is to use Black history as a vehicle for a conversation about cyclical transformations in our nation's past that have everything to do with where we are right now. So it's both Black history and celebration of Black History Month, but it's also a very important set of suggestions on my part, some information and urgings to you to think in terms of these cyclical evolutions about where we are right now and how we are in the midst of a third reconstruction. Okay, so where do we begin? Very quickly, I know some of you are quite schooled in Black history, but I thought I would start. So each of the PowerPoint is organized into themes, sections. This section is entitled Seeking Freedom. And so here, I just want to mention that in the pre-Civil War period, there were 500,000 free Black people. And we tend to focus almost entirely on the 4.5 million enslaved Black people. Very clearly, they were the majority of Black people toiling away in chattel slavery. But in fact, there were also 500,000 free Black people, half of them in the North, and believe it or not, half of them in the South, right in the midst of slavery institution. And so I want to share with you that there were important Black community organizations, mutual aid societies, benevolent associations, schools, orphanages, independent Black churches, and independent Black newspapers. And oftentimes these were the most privileged of the Black community members, but nonetheless, they led and funded these institutions. And so it is simply to suggest to you that in a few slides, when we get to Reconstruction, and suddenly there are all these Black men who are in fact elected to public office holding in Congress and as lieutenant governors of southern states, the question becomes, well, where did these Black people come from? And what I'd like you to understand is that before the Civil War, there was a small but nonetheless very proactive and engaged free Black community. And I would use the term self-determination and self-help to describe they're both taking care of themselves, but also, as you can see in this slide, they were prominent in launching Black anti-slavery newspapers. So there were these two agendas of self-help and also the larger issue of self-determination to pursue freedom for not just themselves, but for all Black people. And so there are a couple of slides here. Clearly, the Black church was instrumental. It has been the major institution that has always been organized by and under the control of Black people. And so as an institution, it has been critical to self-determination in Black communities. Some of you may not be aware that there were, for the most part, there were Black male bishops, but there was the Reverend Julian Jane Tillman, who was an AME preacher. She wasn't fully recognized by the AME Church, but she enjoyed a career as a minister, preaching in various parts of the country, primarily in free areas, not so much in the midst of slavery. And then anyone who's familiar with the Black Masons knows that the Masons themselves go back to celebrating Prince Hall. He is the founder of the African Lodge of North America, the inception of the Black Masons. And then we turn our attention to the Civil War itself, the nation ripping itself apart about slavery. And the South determined to continue with slavery, and Lincoln's position of, well, I've been elected to the presidency and my job is to hold the Union together. These visuals are actual lithographs and paintings and drawings from that period. Here on the upper left is a celebration. Some of you saw the movie Glory. This is the celebration of the Black Battalion. Some hundred, you can see on the right-hand side, I've given you some information on the number of Black men who served in the Union Army, the Union Navy, and also here on the lower panel is the victory march of Union troops through Charleston, South Carolina, a major point of defeat, not the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy, but a major point at which the war was really turning towards the Union Army victory. A number of 186,000 Black men enlisted and fought in the war. There were racial hierarchies in the war in terms of, I'm sorry, in the Army in terms of pay inequities. Okay, so clearly that's not everything that should be said, but in the interest of time, I thought I would provide you with that information. Okay, so the Civil War tears the country apart. And Reconstruction, regardless of wherever it happens in the world, is an attempt to put things back together again and improve them. Since the whole point of things coming apart usually is that things have somehow become unsustainable, and a reconstruction is the part of putting it back together. And in this case, the major goal of Reconstruction was to establish citizenship for Black people and to make of Black people African Americans as citizens of the country. And so Reconstruction, formal Reconstruction, lasted from 1865 for 12 years to 1877. Its reverberated well beyond that, but as historians, we kind of mark this period as the period of Congress's crusade to establish biracial democracy in the South. So we begin with the 13th Amendment in 1865. We all know that this amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude. And there's an important extra piece in that language, and that is, except for the conviction of a crime. And for those of you familiar with what replaced slavery in the South for Black men, many Black men, it was the convict lease system, where they were just pulled in for simply not agreeing with a white person, for not being employed. At the moment, laws in southern states allowed sheriffs to arrest them and write a contract that leased them out to a corporation or a farm or a company. And so that became known as the infamous convict lease system, and it exploited Black men. And it was only made possible legally by that last piece, that last phrase in the 13th Amendment. Then, of course, the 14th Amendment, many of my students have heard me say, if there was just one part of the United States Constitution that I would save, if somehow something happened and we were only able to save one amendment, it would be the 14th Amendment, because it guarantees the rights of citizens. It establishes equal protection under the law. It guarantees citizenship to every person born in the United States, an issue that we now know is under contention. We'll get to that later. It made every person a citizen of a state. It defined specific rights of citizens, and it protected them against the abuse of power of state governments, particularly in the context of slavery having just ended. The 14th Amendment also established due process of law. It threatened to deprive states of representation in Congress if Black men could not vote, meaning the issue right before the nation at this point was having lost roughly 650,000 lives to a war over slavery. That war ending, what was going to change and what was going to be different, and in what way would the nation go forward? And Congress, the decision in Congress was to insist that Black men be allowed to vote. And so that also meant that the 3/5 clause, that was an instrumental part of slavery, was abolished. And it reduced representation in the South of any Black male, of any male, but particularly at this point, an attempt to add Black men to the franchise was not permitted to vote. So I hope I'm not going too fast here. Okay, so these are, in fact, some of you know about this group of Black men. This is a very famous painting from the late 19th century, and these are just some of the Black men that, in fact, served in the United States Congress, and their names are here. And so to the question, earlier I I suggested to you that there was a small but nonetheless very active free Black community during slavery. A good number of these men were, so to speak, standing near an opportunity door. And when Reconstruction emerged, they only had to step forward and say, well, I'm a banker, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a professional. And in some instances, they were not. They were sometimes a self-taught entrepreneur, a small business owner in the free Black community. And in several cases, some of them had been, in fact, enslaved men who had been either taught themselves or been taught literacy, how to read and write. And so here they are. And here are the dates. I'm not going to go through this. It's just to give you some sense that we know very well about this attempt to establish biracial democracy in the South. And we know something about these men and where they served the states and their occupations and their pre-war status. And so, as you can see, some had been enslaved, but quite a few had been already free Blacks. And so this goes back to that earlier slide where we were looking at the free Black community. Okay, so in my opinion, as a historian, and many, many historians in the country would agree, Reconstruction was a good idea. It certainly was necessary given the wear and tear and disruption that the Civil War caused, particularly in the South, to its infrastructure. The Freedmen's Bureau was created as a post-war intervention institution. So with that agenda that we can describe as advancement for African Americans, there is the pendulum coming back. There was a very virulent backlash. And so it took the form of immediate, really aggressive violence against people who had just the month before or the year before been someone's property, and now they are free. And the white South's response, maybe not every day, not everyone, but the majority response was, we lost the war, we're angry about that, and we simply do not want to give Black men, especially civil rights and voting rights. And so it is in this period that white mobs form themselves and begin going into Black communities and massacring. The Colfax massacre, the Hamburg massacre, the massacre in New Orleans, Texas, Mississippi. These are places where there's a majority Black population because of slavery. And these are now areas where if Black men are allowed to vote, they can vote their numbers and they can step up and participate in constitutional democratic voting. And on the far right here, you see the last two panels really focus on the KKK. In the 19th century, the robes were not white as they have been in the 20th century and now. In the 19th century, the robes were Black. And this is really a picture of a photograph of the founding of the KKK. Okay. All right. So this has the effect. So there is considerable and widespread physical violence against primarily Black men, but also in some instances Black women and children. And now that Black men were able to vote, this is a period where white South commits itself to come what may, making sure that Black people are not allowed to vote, that Black men especially, no women, white women, nor Black women, nor Mexican women living in the Southwest were at this point allowed to exercise the franchise. So it would be the early 20th century before women attained the right to vote under the Constitution. And so we call this period of backlash disfranchisement. And the consequence here is that state by state, the Black vote, the vote is taken away from Black men. And it's taken away through poll taxes, a literacy test where whites are not asked to memorize the state constitution and to be able to recite it, but Blacks are. and that refers to the understanding clause. There's the grandfather clause down in South Carolina and Louisiana that stipulated that if your grandfather voted before the Civil War, you could vote, but if your grandfather did not vote before the Civil War, you were ineligible to vote. So these were various and nefarious means in the South of taking away the franchise. And so this graph shows you we were just focusing on the number of Black men who served in Congress between 1867 and here 1900. And this graph shows you what happened to their numbers. This is what disfranchisement accomplished. It drove them from elective office, both at the national level, the state level, and the local level, even in places where some Black men had been elected as the sheriff or the constable. They were driven out of all of those spaces. And so this period of a backlash is the beginning of institutionalized, separate and unequal. And it was held in place by sustained violence. To date, we count over 3,700 lynchings. We have an official record of all of these lynchings between 1889 and 1932. And in Georgia alone, in 1 year, in 1882, there were 800 Black men lynched. So violence was savage. And here on the right, these are pictures from postcards that were photographs of lynchings. And then whites wrote on the postcard and mailed the postcard home to family members. And that's what you see with a picture of all the brothers in one household were lynched. And someone at the lynching wrote on the postcard, a white guy wrote on the postcard and mailed it home to his mother that he had been at a lynching. And you can see on the bottom, there was no shortage of protests. This is here in the North, protest against lynching. And the film that is a classic defense of the Klan, Birth of a Nation. So just to show you what Jim Crow, there's no way that we have adequate time to unpack all of it, but so for instance, this is the budget for South Carolina public schools in 1908, 1909. On the right, you see, and on the right and left, you see that there are almost comparable numbers of Black and white pupils. There is some real difference in male teachers. There's a dramatic difference in the numbers of female teachers, total numbers of pupils, average attendance, and then at the bottom, the staggering and disproportionate expenditures on educating children. So this was the face of exclusion based on race. This is Jim Crow in the South. So the Jim Crow system reached everywhere, both North and South. In the South, it was by law. It was written down. You didn't have to wonder whether or not you could go into a certain restroom or use a certain water fountain or a library or a hospital, whether you could be buried in a certain cemetery. It was by law after Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And if you're wondering why that Supreme Court case is so important, is because it established the watershed, it established the precedent that was not pulled down until Board versus Brown, Board v. versus Brown of Education. And so this established separate and unequal. And everywhere in the South, it was instituted. And I would argue it was also instituted in the North, but we call it de facto, meaning in the North, it was seldom written down. One didn't walk up to an establishment and see white and colored signs appearing above the door. One just understood there were areas where, as a Black person, you could not live there. You weren't going to get a job there. You weren't going to be welcome there. And in that way, whites established de facto segregation up north. So bottom line, separate but equal quickly meant inferior facilities or no facilities, unequal schools, unequal teachers' salaries, and unequal or non-existent social services. So all of this represents the pushback, backlash. So here now, moving forward, we step into this, what continues even during the backlash, self-help in Black communities. At the very same time that there is this exclusion, this backlash, there's also the emergence of national African American organizations. And they're listed here. I'm not going to read through them. It's just to give you a sense that even during this pushback, this lack of significant advancement, or directly what I would say is opposition to advancement, there continued to be self-help engagement and activity. Here are some of the really key leaders: Carter G. Woodson, Mary McLeod Bethune, who later served in President Roosevelt's cabinet, and who's the founder of Bethune College, that is now Bethune-Cookman College. Marcus Garvey, of course, with his emphasis, an organization builder, and his emphasis on Black nationalism. Sarah Breedlove, the first Black millionaire in the country, with her skincare and hair care products. And then Black men and Black women start fraternities and sororities in cases here, both predominantly white institutions as well as historically Black colleges and HBCUs. So the second reconstruction. So we come upon now advancement, opposition, self-help, self-determination, and now the second really major threshold place where Jim Crow is in place. It is very clear. Even the Supreme Court comes to agree that Jim Crow segregation is unfair and it renders it unconstitutional. But before we start with the Brown decision, let me share with you that Black men and women have fought in America's wars, and returning Black veterans from World War II were, as it turns out, quite important, having gone abroad, having helped to defend fascism, but also having been in places where Jim Crow was missing. So these were men who came back with a different sense of possibility. And we have to count them as part of, along with the Black women who served in World War II, as among those who would have been eager and willing to stand up for a change and for an insistence on civil rights. So now we turn our attention to the law itself. The most important, as it was after the Civil War, the most important threshold change in the nation at that time. And so here it is the change in the law that once again, as was the case after the Civil War, becomes essential and determinative of Black people's access to human rights and civil rights. And so on our radar screen, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It fought segregation and discrimination in education, housing, employment, voting. They recruited a cadre of Black and multiracial lawyers. They were mostly male, but as you can see on the right, Constance Baker Motley, as a woman, was instrumental also in helping to move the work of the NAACP forward. And some of you have seen the recent Postal Service stamp that actually commemorates Mrs. Motley, Counselor Motley. And so these are some of the cases that led to dismantling Jim and Jane Crow laws in the South. So let me say here, we can change the law, but changing the law in and of itself doesn't necessarily change people's hearts. Sometimes it does, but very often we can change the law, but it takes a good deal more effort and commitment and engagement to change people's hearts. And it is their hearts that sometimes influences their behavior. So with the law, we can say, you can do this, you can do that, you can act in this way, and we don't want you to act in this other way. But it's a much more challenging engagement to change what's going on in people's hearts and minds. Nonetheless, here are the cases, some of the major cases that preceded Brown, and I would argue that made Brown possible. And all of these cases, Sequel, Sweet, McLaurin, Smith, Briggs, all of these cases focused on adult engagement and adult access to for the most part, education. It wasn't until Brown that the NAACP strategized that it was important to focus on the impact that segregation had on negative self-esteem and psychological well-being for Black children, and that if harm was being done to children, then that harm was already very early in life and likely, very, very likely could continue through the years following childhood. And so, in fact, it would be the baby doll test, the baby doll child tests that were instrumental during the Brown decision. And that was one of the first times, if not the first time, that an expert witness, a social scientist, was brought into the courtroom and allowed to provide testimony to the high court. It has become commonplace nowadays for us to think of expert witnesses in the courtroom, but in the 50s, it was rare. It was a rarity. And then, of course, following Brown, there was even Gale versus Browder that explicitly overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. So changes in the law represented a major entree point for the second Reconstruction. And so what were the goals of the civil rights movement? First and foremost, to open access to equal opportunity and destroy the Southern doctrine of de jure, meaning by law, and the Northern, by custom, race-based segregation. We are still struggling with the de facto race-based segregation here in Long Island and in other parts of the nation as well. Secondly, a goal was to diminish discrimination and the lack of equal opportunity. Next, a goal was to change the government's behavior, especially the enforcement, the really kind of shabby lack of the enforcement of due process and equal protection of the law. It was really uneven. There were times when the federal government would step in, but more rare than otherwise. And of course, particularly to prompt the government to encourage and defend access to public institutions and accommodations and access to trade and business opportunities. Another goal of the civil rights movement was to establish equity for marginalized citizens, not just Black people, but also Native Americans, Latinx people, Asian Americans, and also to promote equality of opportunity, policies and practices that remedy disparate treatment or adverse impact on racial and ethnic minorities. Adverse impact has a cumulative effect on people's lives. And so a real issue becomes, how do you remedy past hurt, past harm? How do you try to fix adverse impact? Another goal was to create remedies for harm done in the past, as I've just referred to, and then to advance rights, privileges, and benefits which a citizen is entitled to exercise. So these were lofty goals, and a good many of them have been accomplished, but this is an important statement that we have seen in front of us, that reconstructions raise the bar. Reconstructions are not just, let's go back to the status quo, let's go back to what we were doing. Reconstructions really are an attempt to say, we owe it to ourselves as a constitutional democracy to do something different and to do it better, and to do some things that we haven't done before, because in fact it improves, stabilizes, and improves the nature of our constitutional democracy. In the case of the civil rights movement, Black people's civil rights, human and civil rights, were at the center of some of these concerns, as were the human and civil rights of Asians, Native Americans, and Latinos and Latinas as well. So here are just some historical pictures. Some of you are very familiar with them. I'm not going to step through each of them. There are any number of things represented here that are both civil rights movement challenges, as well as some of the movement's achievements, some of its leadership, some of its victims. But here you see there was significant engagement on both the side of advancing human and civil rights as well as opposing human and civil rights. So it was complicated, but it gives you, this is just a little window into some of its complexities. And then I thought I'd share this slide with you. These are some of the Black heroes, just a small smattering across different areas. Drew in medicine, Davis in the military, Powell in the military, Carson in medicine, Jemison in space travel, NASA, Coleman, pilot, Thurgood Marshall, of course, the lawyer that argued the Brown decision, who was later promoted to the Supreme Court as a Supreme Court justice. Ida B. Wells, we owe much of what we know about the reporting on the lynching of Black men from her travels and her written exposés and her publications. Lawrence and Bluford in the military, Robinson, athletics, Gibson, athletics, and of course, Marian Anderson, the gifted contralto singer. So what is it the movement accomplished? One of its major, and I would argue most important accomplishments that was linked with changes in the law was that Black voting power and Black engagement in politics emerged and flourished. So the effect of the Voting Rights Act. So my students have heard me say that if I could only choose one of the many civil rights legislations that the nation has produced, it would in fact be the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not necessarily one of the acts that's entitled the Civil Rights Act of 57, 1960, 1964, 1990, on and on. It is because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, and to this date remains, if not the only, one of the only pieces of federal legislation that not only states an ideal or a goal, but that includes an enforcement mechanism. So in other words, it makes it somebody's job, or it made it someone's job. As you can see on the graph on the left, it made it the Justice Department's job to go into the South and register Black people to vote. And that's what they did. And within 14 months to 2 years, 80% of the Black voting age population in the South was registered to vote. The map on the right shows you in 1960, and again in 1960, and again in 1971, you can see the demographic change that was represented by the registration of new Black voters and their access to the franchise. That produced and elevated the careers of people like Shirley Chisholm here in the North. It also meant the rise of Black elected officials, and I've given you the numbers from the 20th century at about the time when the Voting Rights Act had real teeth in it and was enforced, and it just transformed the Black electorate. It transformed voting in the nation. It was an important addition as a second reconstruction to fulfilling the nation's quest to be a constitutional democracy. So the civil rights movement's accomplishments: 2 Brown decisions destroyed the legal foundation for racial segregation. White resistance to racial integration was directly challenged. The federal government was forced to intercede through all branches. There were key victories between 54 and 65, although there was also plenty of physical and emotional pain and suffering. There was direct action, nonviolent social protests, and it was victorious. There were well-organized protests and courageous leaders, some of whom lost their lives in defense of their action. African Americans understood that they had, after 58 plus years, accomplished putting Plessy, which was legally sanctioned apartheid, away from the future. And there was landmark civil rights legislation, including the most far-reaching enforcement-based Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that even though it was certainly not an easy undertaking nor an easily accomplished important set of goals, there was again opposition, a pushback, backlash. There was massive white resistance to the civil rights movement, both legal and in the form of the Southern Manifesto, signed in 1956. At the time, President Eisenhower, the decorated World War II general who ran for the presidency and was elected, initially was reluctant to send federal troops into Arkansas, specifically Little Rock Central High School. Nonetheless, when in fact mobs surrounded the Black students and the school, threatening to lynch them, Eisenhower sent federal troops to defend the Black students and uphold the authority of the federal courts, since not only were Black civil rights being threatened, but the authority of federal courts was directly threatened. And here on the right is a photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, who on this particular day was separated from the other 8 students and so walked alone and was taunted by an angry white crowd. Now, the most by far visible indication of backlash is the carceral state, the new Jim Crow, the process of incarcerating record numbers of Black and Latino men, the trashing, if you will, by political conservatives, Nixon followed by Reagan, of trashing the poor, rolling back federal welfare and jobs programs. In the South, Reagan insisted that discrimination was a myth, just wasn't true. Reagan scapegoated welfare queens or supposedly irresponsible Black women, accusing them of exploiting federal handouts to justify major cuts to federal welfare. And so this is a period of time of a frontal attack on the Black poor. The other form it took is the war on drugs, also declared by Reagan. This federalized laws that increased prison sentences for drug possession, so that in middle-class communities, if people were arrested for possession of cocaine, it was considered legally a misdemeanor. In working class communities, if people were arrested and possessed crack, it was a felony. And this continued right up and through Clinton's presidency, where he publicly defended the disparate sentencing for the 2 levels of drug use. So by the numbers, between 1980 and 2000, I think this chart speaks for itself. In a country where Black people were barely 12% of the population and presumably potentially 12% of illegal drug users, they made up 41% of all those arrested on cocaine and heroin charges. So that was at 1980 to 2000, and this chart is 2000 to 2009. Once again, for the relatively far smaller numbers, minority status, numerically speaking, of the Black population, the rates of incarceration for Black men are all out of proportion to other groups, white and Latino men. So we certainly wouldn't want to say that Black people are using drugs at a much higher rate than white people are. So if that's a fallacy, then it must certainly be that there are disproportionate levels of apprehension, sentencing, and disparate incarceration. And so we refer to this as the carceral state, the new Jim Crow. So even while that is unfolding, again, there is a third reconstruction emerging. This one is really much more broad-based across the nation. And it takes the form of electing a young mixed race man, and because he's mixed race, he's biracial, for the most part, as far as the census was concerned, he was listed as a Black man, Barack Obama. So this third reconstruction, again, there are these progressive forces that rally themselves and that lift the nation forward, electing a Black man to the presidency. Not all of it pretty and easy. This New Yorker magazine cover comparing Mr. and Mrs. Obama to terrorists was a deep stir. But again, it spoke to the legacy of racism and sexism in our nation's past. Nonetheless, this was a period where this third Reconstruction took the form of the nation opening to what historically had only been possible in the late 19th century, and that is the emergence of Black men in senior leadership positions in the government. Nonetheless, that has also been followed by a virulent backlash, beginning with George Zimmerman being acquitted of what was clearly an aggressive posture on his part. The police had asked him to stand down. He did not. He got out. He accosted Trayvon Martin and eventually shot him. Martin was unarmed. And nonetheless, Zimmerman was acquitted. And so this again, yes, this is only in one part of the country. Yes, it's only this one circumstance and this one issue, but it speaks to the increasingly less important value of Black male lives. And that is part of the backlash. So the past is never dead. It's not even past. I'm coming to the end of what my comments will be. Once again, these are just many different visuals, some of them very current. And that quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," is by the famous white Southern writer William Faulkner. And so we see in these vignettes here that are represented in these pictures, like a photograph or a scenario, if you will, of some of what we know is going on even as we speak. And so where to now? Where are we going? What is this about? So I'm going to bring this conversation up to the level where I think it bears us pondering very seriously that we're looking at a challenge to democracy. Very clearly, we're looking at progress and opposition to civil rights for racial ethnic minorities, but this is also fundamentally a challenge to the Constitution and democracy itself. So what is democracy? So I've said a bit about where the word comes from. We know it's of the people, by the people, for the people. But some of you may not have thought about the ways in which, as we know it, has been a series of political, economic, intellectual, and social developments spanning the past several centuries. And it has reduced the power of kings and queens, feudal lords, slaveholders, industrial and banking magnates, absolutist religious doctrines, dictators, and colonial dominators. Democracy is a powerful weapon on behalf of freeing people's lives. It has served that purpose. It has been a challenge to completely embrace it and move it forward consistently, but nonetheless, it has served as the pillar of this nation's development. So, is our democracy threatened? Is it threatened? Okay. So here again, I've presented you with visuals from any number of meetings, rallies, things going on across the country. The cry for democracy, the insistence that democracy is not dictatorship, votes for women, opening the way for democracy, and embracing our varied and wonderful tapestry of racial ethnic diversity. And I do want to ask you to think about the fact that democracy is not a spectator sport. It has to be engaged and renewed in each lifetime for each generation. And so where are we? Well, we're now looking at articulated hate and extremism, the rise of the radical right and its entry into the mainstream. This presents as hostile and extreme. I'm here speaking of Mr. Trump, taps into white discontent, seeks power in an established party, at mass meetings calls it a movement, not a campaign. Meetings encourage white supremacy aggression, as they still do. White hate actions against people of color increase to the point now where people of color are being referred to as those who would poison our blood, white blood. Internal hate targets as ethnicity politics, painting all Mexicans and Latinas with a hate brushstroke, espousing a desire to be a dictator, expressed directly now, explicitly, restricting new citizenship to whites by doggedly expelling undocumented people of color, thereby destroying a possible citizenship path for especially Latino and Latino adults. And of course, no new voters, ensuring that people of color are once again disfranchised. External hate targets, Muslim and non-white immigrants, Islamophobia, rabid nativism, racial profiling and police excessive force, rejecting presidential election results, praising dictators in Russia and Korea as strong leadership. And in fact, just this week, insisting that that the U.S. would not remain members of NATO, and that Russia should proceed to intimidate NATO partners. Okay. So, warning signs that fascism is too close, denying elections, attempting to control mass media, establishing propaganda fake news, and representing it as accurate and trustworthy. How many people are you having conversations with who you know are not really informed in important ways and who are adopting and absorbing fake news? They won't call it fake news, but it amounts to absorbing propaganda, very hate-based propaganda. Suppression of public services, especially public health. Think about what happened when COVID hit a few years ago. Weakening civil liberties, intertwining religion and government, blurring any line between personal fortune making and office holding, thereby making it very difficult for a democratic citizenry to hold leaders accountable, prioritizing and protecting corporate power, suppressing labor unions, disdain for intellectuals and the arts. We are fortunate that the National Endowment for the Arts is still in business, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Powerful urgings towards racialized nationalism, that is the elevation of white supremacy, disdain for the recognition of racial ethnic minorities, disdain for human rights of religious minorities. Look at the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment, the suppression of diversity and inclusion, the closing of racial ethnic programs, the closing of DEI programs, the closing of diversity and inclusion efforts, and the destruction of ideas and books, especially historical accounts that would render the nation's history more accountable and visible. So I want to submit that these are warning signs that totalitarianism is a little too close for us to ignore, remembering that we are the people. So, conclusion, where are we? What's at stake? So, American society has undergone social advancements in human and civil rights since its inception, initially to reckon with chattel slavery, and subsequently to advance freedom, citizenship, equality, and multiracial ethnic democracy. These represent both the challenges and the promise of the reconstructions. Each time there has been a systemic advancement, it has been met with a virulent opposition or backlash, including as we speak. The very serious challenge at this moment is the rise of totalitarian agendas or the rise of fascism. We are at a turning point, a key moment, one which defenders of multiracial ethnic democracy insist is the necessity of restraining this world power, armed with nuclear weapons, capable of destroying the entire planet in one day, from destroying its constitution and all progress towards human and civil rights. So I thank you. Our destiny is in our hands. This is a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt some years ago. So questions. Let me back out of the
Yeah, and I'll
share.
unmute.
Yeah.
I can unmute everybody.
Yes, I'm trying. Oh, stop share. That's what I'm trying.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
make sure that I can unmute everybody now.
All right.
I
So,
have
Oh,
I have a question. Hi, this is Melissa Russo. I student work with Huntington Historical Society, and as you're speaking, it's making me think about all of the tenants that are being publicly that are public in Project 2025, which is the manifesto that the Conservative Party has put forth, showing exactly what they're going to do step by step to bring everything back to what it was during, almost during the antebellum period. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about that and how we can really get that out, because I don't think a lot of people know about Project 2025. And by the time they find out, I feel like it would be too late.
okay, Melissa, you were breaking up a little bit. You're on
Okay.
your, no, I think I think we all have a sense of what it is, the point you're making, and what you're putting before us. So, yeah, this is a very serious threat to in terms of where we are right now, and not many people know about it. It's consistent with the concern that I've raised here at the end about the proximity of an agenda of the not just conservative right, but this is really the far right. And wherever we see this in the developing world, in Europe or here, we recognize it's kind of knowing when you see something coming and you can kind of begin to recognize it even from a distance um, as something that's really going to be adverse and depleting. And so, yes, you're right. This is an agenda that, frankly speaking, I don't know that American democracy would survive this agenda. Because it has as its goal to establish a dictatorship. And at least Trump himself is not in denial about that. He was asked, is he seeking a dictatorship? And he said on the record, yes, on day one. So so a dictatorship would, just shred the Constitution. So but the point I've made is that not so much this too shall pass, but rather that for each way in which progress and advancement have raised the bar, an attempt to suppress the raising of the bar has grown more and more and more ferocious. And we're at that point right now. So thank you for your concern. And also, I encourage everyone to look up and read up on what Melissa is referring to.
there was in the chat, I don't know, there was just what about, there was a question earlier when you were speaking, Professor. There was a Black man who had come home from, I don't know if you're familiar with this situation, from fighting his country in World War II, and was blinded by a gang on a bus when he rode home. I'm not familiar with that incident myself.
Well, I am. I am, and I'm not remembering his name right now, but he was in uniform, and the bus driver required him. They had stopped at a stop, and he was getting back on the bus, and he was spoken to in a harsh way by the bus driver. Sorry, and he pushed back on that being spoken to, and then white men drug him away, put him in jail, beat him up, punched out his eyes. And by the time any help could arrive, he was dead.
Oh my God.
And some of you know that very recently, the federal government has just apologized for the 20 Black servicemen who in Texas, Brownsville, Texas, had defended themselves from a white mob. And when they defended themselves, they were arrested. All 20 were court-martialed and they were shot. So just this past fall, the U.S. government apologized on behalf of the nation to the families of these men. Are there other questions?
There's other comments in the chat, but there was another they were talking about the impact of segregated schools began with the first American public schools in Boston. in 1635. And then there was another comment, African Americans in the Revolutionary War, i.e. Cyprus Attucks, first American kill.
Crispus Attucks, yeah.
Sorry, so I was blocking something by cursor. And approximately 19K American, for African Americans fought in the well, I guess they're saying thousands, fought for the Americans during that. I'm not really fully understand that comment, but then the next question was from Bernadette: did the service men were they granted the GI Bill? It's a question about that.
I imagine she's referring to after World War II.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so actually, since we're right here on Long Island, there's a very, very focused and present point to be made. So the GI Bill was not explicitly racially segregationist, but let me unpack Levittown.
Oh yeah, we just had a speaker talking about Levittown too.
Levittown is the example of the extensions of that. So the GI Bill was the nation's way of saying thank you for your service. It was also a way of saying we, at the policy level, are going to redistribute wealth. And the primary way that you can redistribute wealth in this society is to transfer property and real estate. And so these were by and large working class men who had gone off to risk their lives on behalf of saving the nation from the Nazis and from the Japanese, from fascism. And so they returned home, and here was the GI Bill for education. Here were federally insured, federally established loans, 3%, guaranteed by the federal government on behalf of being a homeowner. And in fact, that's what Levittown is here. The same thing is true of Levittown in Pennsylvania. Here's the catch. Levittown here and in Pennsylvania, by decree of the federal government, was white only. Black servicemen were excluded in the language from having access to these low-cost, federally insured, guaranteed loans, mortgage loans. And so Levittown here and Levittown in Pennsylvania, there might even be one in New Jersey, but they're white. They have served as a form of wealth building. These are now couples who are retiring, and if they've been able to pay off their mortgage, that the value of that real estate property is part of their retirement kitty. So Black men were, by policy, federal policy, prevented from accessing this entitlement. And instead, when we look at public housing projects in Brooklyn, Manhattan, in Harlem, in other cities, other parts of the country, Newark and other parts, New Jersey, those were the only places where Black servicemen were allowed to rent. And so they were never able to build equity in the form of redistributing wealth transfer. And so when you see the numbers about the staggering disparities in the median wealth indexes for Black and white families, don't delete the story of how in the post-World War II period, there was this continuing de facto segregation, so that white soldiers had access to mortgages and Black soldiers did not, whether you had been in the Navy or in the Army or the Air Force. Of course, it was quite a while before Black men were allowed to serve in the Marines as they more currently have been able to. So that's a big piece of the poverty story. So I often say to people, there are a number of opportunity doors in any given society. And if that opportunity door is shut, so under slavery, that opportunity door had a teeny little crack in it for free Blacks. And they were able, with self-determination and a great deal of insistence, and to be honest, some white allies, more so in the North in the form of white abolitionists than in the South. But that opportunity door had a teeny little crack in it. And what Reconstruction did was to open that opportunity door a little further. And that meant there were Black men serving as lieutenant governor, as sheriff, as member of Congress, House of Representatives, in the Senate. Unthinkable just maybe 5 years before that. But reconstructions have that potential to be places where not only does the bar get raised, but the opportunity door, the crack in the opportunity door swings open a little more. And it doesn't happen magically. It takes effort to open that opportunity door. It takes commitment. It takes coalition building. all of the things that some people have learned successfully to do by way of making important progress in this nation. Then if we look forward, if we go into the 20th century, Jim Crow, the backlash in the late 19th century and early 20th century attempts to narrow that opportunity door once again so that it is barely again at a crack. But nonetheless, Black people and other ethnic groups, Asians, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and other Latinos continue to advocate in their communities and building self-determination. They don't lay down and play dead. But the opportunity door doesn't move very much in this period until the post-World War II period. And the catalyst, the trigger for it, is the death of a 14-year-old Black kid from Chicago, Emmett Till, because the nation now, it was one thing that Black men had been lynched and closed caskets or their bodies drugged from rivers. Here now was a kid on summer vacation who never comes back to Chicago. He's brutalized and his mother leaves the casket open. And this isn't 1925. It isn't 1935. It isn't even 1945. It's in the 1950s. It's after Black men have gone off and some of them not come back. It's after fascism has been defeated. It's after third world countries are looking at the United States for leadership and saying, you say that you're the global leader in democracy, and yet what's going to happen about this child's murder? So there's a mock trial, blah, blah, blah. So there is the opportunity door now, and then there's the Brown decision that we have to factor in. The other Supreme Court decisions, the opportunity door gets wider and wider. It's not open wide, but it opens. And what I like to say is Barack and Michelle Obama are standing near that opportunity door that's open wide enough for them to step through. And why are they standing near the opportunity door? Because they're a product of higher education. And they're lawyers and they're professionals. And that in and of itself is part of the progress that has been carved out following the civil rights movement. And that's the reason for the backlash, because that fact of the past is understood as progress. And there are those forces now stepping forward to say, oh, no, 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 we want that opportunity door closed, almost shut. And I would argue that we have to talk with our neighbors. We have to talk with our friends. I'm not big on social media, things like TikTok and other things like that, but I know other people enjoy it. We have to communicate to other Americans and help them find their right mind and goodwill. What's at stake here is not just whether or not the nation will have a Black president again or a woman president, perhaps. What's at stake here is whether someone's going to strike a match to the Constitution. That's pretty serious, not just for Black people, but for all of us. And that's why I made it part of the end of this PowerPoint. And so, Stephanie, that's why the topics.
Well, I get it. I understand like why, because if we can look at the history in the past, but if we don't understand it and we don't try to move the needle today, the next phase, what's the next phase? We're actually going backwards. I think it's unbelievable. I mean, I look in my lifetime, I'm only in my 50s, and how dire the situation is. And I have someone who wrote in here, Kate was writing, she worked in the civil rights movement in the 60s, she said, and I'm familiar with examples that the professor's talking about. Her father served in World War II and knows about the discrimination in the armed forces. Here is her father is in the armed forces and being discriminated, and he served his country. So she's like, I want to thank you for putting this detail in perspective, because you look at the rights that what had happened in the past, they were taken away. It was like, it goes back and forth, but it's like one step forward, 4 steps back. So what is for, in your opinion, because today we're supposed to be talking about how do we imagine a future that's more inclusive with, because someone's mentioning here with the march to authoritarian, oh my God, with, I can't even say the word today, I'm sorry. With the people that are trying to move it towards a more dictatorial situation, taking rights away and getting away from the Constitution. We as citizens, what can we do in our town, in the country, to make things better?
Okay, so how often do you talk to friends and family members who say, my vote doesn't make a difference?
Oh, Yeah, we talk
right.
about it. Sure,
Oh,
sure.
right. I'm busy, or, I'm just one vote. Right. So this is also about taking away citizenship engagement in the most important way in which we shape and form our nation's government, and that is through the franchise. We vote people in and we vote them out. Now, I don't have to tell anybody on this call that there's no question that Donald Trump should have been told some time ago, you're still an American citizen, you can live here, but you can't come back and run for president again. You were part of an insurrection effort, period, and you can retain your citizenship. So we are up against something really potentially very sinister. There are forces that are saying just disregard the 14th Amendment, just disregard the law, just pack the Supreme Court and disregard the court's insistence that the court serve us in terms of law and democracy. So vote. Right. Now, is that everything? No. Talk to the people we know, people who are just being sucked in to say, well, I saw this on such and such channel, or I heard this. How do you know that's true? Step up and ask and engage people in conversations. We can't tell people what to think and feel. We can discourse with them, we can argue with them, we can present them with information, we can try to say, hey, where's your head about this? Why are you thinking this way? And then I think we have to be prepared to challenge hate directly. We have to be prepared to say, what is this insistence that somebody's blood is going to poison somebody else's nation? We've heard this before. That's why the Japanese were put in internment camps. So, right. It isn't just that it happened someplace else. So I think we have to be willing to call hate out. And sometimes it's camouflaged, but it's becoming increasingly blunt and direct and in our face. And I think we have to answer it. We have to answer it by calling it out for what it is. When people try to dress it up and camouflage what they're really saying, Melissa is saying we have to call out what's really going down, what's really being offered, what's really being positioned. And we have to protect the independent press, because one of the major things fascists do is put a collar on the press and a leash and say, if you don't serve me, you don't live. If you don't serve me, you don't eat. If you don't serve me, we'll come get you. We have to be prepared to do that. Does anybody else have ideas about what we can do? I mean, this must be on your minds about, and some of you are raising children, you have children and grandchildren. What is this about? I mean, this is your future. You're looking at your 5 and 8 and 12-year-olds. This is your body walking around in the future. What do you want for them?
Oh, Irene,
You want a better America? Go ahead.
Irene Moore is on the board. Irene, you got to unmute yourself if you want to say something. Irene Moore is on the board for the Huntington African American Museum, African American Historic Designation Council. There's people on the call here who are some leaders, some significant leaders. There's Robert Hughes, is the town historian, on the call. There's many people here that are trying to move the needle in our town, and since I've known them for like almost a decade, really doing some of the hard work on the ground, but I don't know if you have anything to add, Irene, or Melissa said something already before, Robert,
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you.
Irene, you got to unmute yourself. Or I can do it. I don't think I can run a. Not working. Unmute all.
Can she unmute herself?
I think I know she's on the phone. I'm looking.
Oh, tempting.
I got her. Asked to unmute. Okay. See if she can do it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks,
good.
Irene. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Good
I know you're.
afternoon. My name is Irene Moore. As Stephanie said, I chair the Town of Huntington African American Historic Designation Council. And thank you, Dr. Darling, for informative and educational presentation. I heard Stephanie said that you taught at Georgetown. My daughter is a Georgetown graduate, so I must share this presentation with her. But I have two questions. And the first one is, some of the freed population was able to take on leadership roles shortly after being freed. While enslaved, how were they able to acquire leadership skills under slavery? And the second question is, what is promoting the recent or not so recent movement to turn back the clock? And why do others feel threatened by people of color?
Okay, so I'll take the first question first. So remember, one of the things that we know about this period from the American Revolution right through the Civil War, and even before there's a formal nation, even when there's just slavery colonies, one of the things we know about that is that free Blacks are living in proximity to captive Black people. They're free. Sometimes they purchase their freedom, sometimes they were given their freedom, but they're free, and that means that they build their own houses, they bake their own goods, they sell goods, they have little businesses, they build their churches, they designate leadership for those institutions, they take care of themselves in these small communities. They tend to be overlooked because for all of the 245 years of slavery, they are always a very small minority. But I would argue they're important because they are the ones that build the independent Black institutions. They create the Black church. Prince Hall creates Black Masons. They create early schools. They launch certain lawsuits, like the reference earlier to the pushback on segregation in Boston schools as well before the Civil War. So they are proactive because they're taking care of themselves, but they also understood at each day, so long as slavery remained a dominant institution in the country, no one who had brown skin was really free. At any point, they could walk down the street and someone could think they look like someone who had run away from a plantation and just abscond them or hold them in captive. Or they could be someplace and have people turn to them and say, well, you don't belong here. You're like the people who are slaves. And we don't have to respect you. We don't have to help you build a business. We don't have to lend you money. So in other words, this little community understands they had to provide all the goods and services for themselves. And that's really not any different from what we see in the Mexican community in the Southwest, Mexican American, from what we see in the Asian or the Chinese community in the latter half of the 19th century. If you didn't do it for yourself, it didn't get done. Because the nation by that point was highly racialized. And so that meant racialized politics. And that's there from the very beginning because of slavery when it comes to Black people. So that speaks to who this quarter of a million in the North and a quarter of a million in the South. And we have a good record of what they did in each of these places. And the times at which actually their work was pioneering work, like Freedom's Journal began to publish in 1827. This is the first and oldest independent Black newspaper. 1827 means this newspaper published well before William Lloyd Garrison, who is recognized as the predominant white male abolitionist, well before his Liberator was published in 1830, 1831. People seldom give the Russwurm and his colleague credit for Freedom's Journal, but it is there in 1827, and it's explicitly anti-slavery, and it predates William Lloyd Garrison's publication. Now, do we need to split hairs about that? No, because there's no shortage of how many people stood up against slavery as Black or white abolitionists. But in a nation that tends to minimize Black achievements in the nation's history, Freedom's Journal is important because it is there and it predates white abolitionist publications like The Liberator. Second question you're asking, which that's about here and now. Is that correct?
Yes.
And reframe it for me once again so I can answer it directly, explicitly.
What is promoting the recent or not so recent movement to turn back the clock? And
Okay.
why do others feel threatened by people of color?
Okay, so here we have the third Reconstruction. In the third Reconstruction, the nation either goes forward towards actualizing multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. So that is Black people, mixed race people, Asians, Muslims, Latinx, indigenous people, Native Americans, new immigrants. So there's one vision of America in the rest of the 21st century. And then there are those who are saying, no, 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 we don't want that. We don't want to go forward. We don't want to be more inclusive. We don't want to be more welcoming. We don't want to embrace multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. This is the very same issue that emerged after the Civil War. The difference was that at that point, the main issue was how to take a population of 4.5 million people and make them into American citizens, African Americans, hyphenated Americans, African Americans. The issue now is how to take a diverse range of people and make them hyphenated Americans. And for those who are already hyphenated Americans, the issue is how to strengthen our relationship to the society, how to open the opportunity door even more so that many more people go through this opportunity door and prosper and benefit from the tremendous fruits of this economic engine in this country and around the world. There are those who are saying, no, 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 and they are quite explicit to say, let's go back. Right. They can't say go forward, because they don't have a vision going forward that's better than the one that some of us are espousing. They don't have a better vision. They have a reductionist vision. Let's cut it down, cut it out, and step back into the past. Because in the past, it was about backlash, suppression, control, enslavement, persecution, exclusion, domination of women. In the past, that opportunity door was narrow, and only white males could walk through it. And not even poor white males, but well-to-do white males.
Thank you.
There was Antoinette had a question. I asked her to ask it to you directly. She had it in the chat.
Hi, I'm not Antoinette, I'm Denise.
Oh, I was listening. I was like, oh, hi, Denise. I didn't know you were here. Great to see you.
Hi, that was a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I feel that as a director of the Oyster Bay Historical Society, which is on the North Shore, not too far from Huntington, we have to do a conscious effort in discussing our history more often in spaces that are not used to hearing it, as well as making sure that the history is not being erased, because there are many communities that are not aware that there were people of color here, or even the fact that there was enslaved people here in New York. So we have to make those spaces more relevant for our cause of showcasing who we were and what things we've done in the past. And to let people know that it's an effort for all of us. We have to be on one accord to make this known. And that's one of the things that I've been doing throughout the year, going to different places, making sure people are aware, because my family was one of the few that were free people of color in the early mid 1800s. However, like you said, if we didn't get it done, it wasn't going to get done.
That's right.
You know?
So I have an idea. One of the things that historical societies do exceptionally well is to host exhibits. So maybe put your thinking cap on about an exhibit, not necessarily a budget buster, doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but an exhibit that brings some of these issues forward. And so yes, it'd be great to have a Black History Month exhibit, but the issues that we're putting in front of us today are Black history and beyond. So what about an exhibit that represents the question of what could we do and look like as a multiracial, multi-ethnic constitutional democracy? What does that look like? Let us not assume that people have a vision of that, what it would look like, and that it would be okay. Because we're hearing from too many people, oh no, we'll be afraid of that, push back on that, run away from that. And run where? To the past? Ooh, the past is heavy with pain. You know, the future holds some promise for our children and grandchildren that things could be better. Why not embrace that? So what about a role that historical societies, Oyster Bay, Huntington and others, the Hempstead, even the museum over in Hempstead, Irene and others, what about the role of reaching people through exhibits and make the exhibit physical in the facility, but virtual so that you can encourage your membership to see it online?
Or even taking tours to the actual places.
Take it.
Taking tours.
Yes. Yes, take a tour. Yes.
Well, Denise has a tour company that she is highlighting significant Black history throughout Long Island. That's one of the things she's doing. And Denise, put it in the chat. Everybody can share. And she's the other speaker. She came to speak to us in November. And we talked about, her doctoral dissertation was on the cultural and and social achievements of free after enslavement. So that was a very interesting topic that she did. We didn't have it taped, of course, but because it was at the restaurant, but it was very insightful. It was very personal to her, but I'm sure she could share that with you, right, Denise, with Dr. Darling?
Saying was right on point. From the time of enslavement to the present, that window of opportunity was very small.
Oh, right, that's right.
And there was record. We, working in a historical society, provides you the access to look through documents and archives that you might not see in the general eye, public eye. I have a previous past president here, Kate Ludlam, who knows the voyage, the journey, so to speak. So I can, definitely look into our archives and see that we had someone of color who was the earliest emancipated person back in 1685, which is pretty early in Oyster Bay.
That's very early. Yeah.
If he was, the Oyster Bay was founded in 1653, but he led that way for a lot of people that were slowly becoming emancipated and created descendant communities for people of color.
And that's a long time before New York emancipated enslaved Africans. Yeah.
So,
bravo.
Yeah, so we have other questions in here too, Professor. There was a question, well, one, someone had a comment that where's that one? Marie wanted to thank you for insightful presentation. She has 4 biracial grandchildren. She wants to raise them to be activists and value education and be upstanders whenever they are faced with injustice. So she's empowered by your talk today. And then there was also, I don't know who this person is, it was unidentified, but how did President Trump how is he allowed to jump through legal hoops, and how is he able to lead the Republican Party as a potential candidate after storming the Capitol and challenging an elected president? Do you have concerned about citizens to have a stage? Should we, as concerned citizens, should we stage another march on Washington? How do concerned citizens stop this progression? I think you talked about that a little bit already, and I like your idea. And Denise and I are buddies, so this is fantastic. Because with the anniversary of America coming up, there's 6 standards by New York State. How are we more inclusive in telling our history? How do we give voice? But then going a step further to talking about the future, what can it look like? That's brilliant. That's a grant, Denise. That's
good.
Like
thinking cap. Yeah.
So that's great advice.
We have a gentleman's hand raised here, sir. Yes. Would you unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I appreciate the talk. My name is Ron Daniels. I'm a member of the Huntington Youth Board. I'm also an author. You asked for ideas on how we can improve things. One of the ways we might want to think about is to broaden the narrative. And what I mean by that is that we can't keep talking about slavery, and that we know that all happened. But I am a proponent of going back in history in terms of when things were better. Okay, I've written 3 books pertaining to Africans and Africans of great knowledge. Okay, the Moors, the Egyptians, Kush. Okay, Kemet, and so we have to give a model for our young people to see where we were not the ones being the victims. We have to be where we are the ones who bring about peace. For instance, the Moors, like you well know, occupied Spain and Portugal for almost 700 years, over 800 years. They allowed the 3 religions, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, to live together in peace. All right. The Rock of Gibraltar is named after Tariq, the Moor general who conquered Spain and Portugal. So this is the type of things we need to present to our kids, something positive that they can copy off of, as opposed to being narratives into slavery and Jim Crow and so forth and so on. We have to take the narrative outside the box. And that's what I propose. And that's
Okay,
what my
sir,
books propose.
sir, I have to say, I agree with you. And I certainly I teach a course on Black history. I start in the ancient world. I even back it up to Australopithecus and the fact that everyone is an African. But in a conversation with people right now, when democracy, I mean, this is a pretty scary time right now, unprecedented. It's been some, scary times before, but what's on the table right now shreds the Constitution and throws it away. I understand what you're saying. I bond with it. I totally get it. I teach it. It's important to give that information to not just our youth, but to everybody. In the same way that American history is good for Black people, Black people's history is good for America. So, and for that matter, Native American history and Asian American history. So I'm a proponent of defending multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. But I understand that right now, in an hour, basically, although we've been talking more than an hour, but in a short conversation between us, I've chosen to say, here we are right now. And sir, I have to say, if we don't get a handle and fix this right now, there won't be books allowed in the schools that represent the history you're talking about. There are already places where there are banned books. And for certain, your name and your books are on some of those lists. So this is unprecedented in terms of the attack here, a frontal attack on everything this country says that it stands for. So I understand, and I get it, and I bond with it, and I know this history, and I certainly teach it. But I thought in a short conversation today, I'd bring Black people's, these epochs, these cyclical manner in which the bar gets raised and then somebody tries to tear it down, throw it away, push it away and say, oh no, we were never about that. We just were about white male power and white supremacy. So I thought in this time we have today, this isn't just about Black people. This is also about, in the next several years, what's going to happen to our nation,
I think mindful of time, not to cut anybody off. I know that some people do have to get back to work, but this conversation, this very vibrant conversation, shows the need to do more. Yes. And our town is ready for this, or at least the group here. Some people I haven't seen on our calls before. So I hope that we can do other programming and bring it and have more discussions so that we can make people aware and change some things, and lift people up instead of, tearing them down. So I think that's as educators, as community leaders, board members, a lot of people here are on different boards and non-for-profits. When we have the opportunity, have our voices be heard and support the events in our town that are informative, right? That are teaching the children and other community members about these important topics. So I think that's kind of like a concluding it, because I know of being mindful of everyone's time. But I appreciate as I knew it would be a fantastic presentation. And luckily we have it taped for other people who weren't able on the call to hear today. And I really am indebted to you for, giving a great history and context for this conversation today. I thank our members, I thank our board members who signed on, and my other organizations that are helping, fight the good fight in the sense of trying to make some significant change in our community. So thank you so much.
And if I can just recommend a book, a new book, it's called The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. Brand new book, Basic Books, 2022, just really recently off the press. Author is Professor Peniel Joseph, Peniel, Peniel Joseph.
I'll put that in my thank you letter. Dr. Darling will send that to me again. And when I do my note to everyone, we'll put that book in there. So that might be something we read as a group. It might be something interesting to do.
It's at the end of the PowerPoint.
Oh,
it's
okay.
ready there under suggested reading. I
Okay,
just didn't pull that slide up.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but can you also include contact information to the doctor as far as a continuation of what we do?
The last slide has, at the bottom of the slide, it has my email, my name.
Fair enough.
And I'd welcome hearing from anyone. And I want to thank you for this invitation. Thank you for this opportunity. I really do consider it a conversation. I've noticed in talking, some of you have been nodding your heads. You get it. You're right there. So thank you. It's very encouraging to talk to people who are just staying awake and paying attention. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.